Hi, I'm Alison from the community team at the Heath Business and Technical Park in Runcorn, and I'm now on to chapter 8 for you from the Bunjee venture by Stan McMurtry. And in the last chapter we met our little character, the orange ball of fur with the spindly legs and sucker feet and the translucent tongue and the translucent trunk and the very cute smile. And he says things like, remember when he said, I'm a best Bunjee in a whirl. No, I'm a only Bunjee. My mummy got eaten by a Tyrannosaurus. My daddy blew himself up till he bust. My sister ate too many eggs and all the rest got the measles and died. And then he'd asked about the piranhas, and they'd realised he was talking about the piranhas. And they thought he was going to help, and he said, coughing in an empty stomach, and they'd gone to find food. And he thinks they're strange for eating fruit, but he's led them to a place where they eat fruit and can eat fruit, and meanwhile he's gone up the cliff to find a pterodactyl's nest. Bunjee stood motionless beside the nest, high on the cliff wall. He felt decidedly odd. A strange rumbling was taking place in his stomach. He rolled his eyes around his head and licked his lips unhappily. He felt nauseated. He glanced at the 6 remaining eggs in the nest, and they lay in their usual neat pile, and normally he would have gobbled them up in seconds, but there was something wrong. The egg that he just swallowed lay heavily and uneasily inside him. He wanted to be sick. He leant over, picked another egg from the nest and cracked it open on a sharp edge of the rock. Well, immediately he knew why he felt sick. The egg was rotten. A foul stench escaped from the broken shell, and what should have been a yellow oak oozed greenly out and splattered on the rock. He screwed up his face in an expression of disgust and let the putrid egg fall to the ground below. He mumbled, almost in tears. I've eaten a rotted egg. He was annoyed with himself for not noticing the signs that the nest had been abandoned. All the signs were there. Small pieces of rock that had fallen from the cliff lay in the bottom. The whole nest was in a state of disrepair. It looked as though it had been abandoned for at least 6 months. But greedily and unthinkingly, he just stuffed one of the eggs into his mouth as soon as he'd reached the nest. Eep, eep, old rotten botheration, he fumed. I'm a stupid Bunjee. He wished now that he was a little bit more like his 2 newly found friends and could eat fruit instead of having to climb laboriously up cliffs hunting for eggs. He glanced downwards to see how they were getting on. He could see Andy lying asleep at the foot of a tree. Karen, he thought, must still be eating. But where was she? He should be able to see her from here. To one side of the wood, the river gurgled and glinted as it wound its way between the rocks and disappeared behind a high hill in the distance. The only other sign of movement was from the tops of the trees as they swayed gently in the soft breeze that wafted along the valley. He screwed his eyes up, straining to see between the leaves and branches far below. Something white moved to the side, one side of the sleeping boy. Dishes, thought Bunjee, relieved. Then he noticed that the white thing had long strings attached to it and was being dragged along the ground. He watched, horrified, as the whole tangled mass suddenly whisked up into the air and disappeared into the dark centre of a sinister, dull green plant. Oh, crikey! Wailed Bunjee, nearly falling off the cliff in fright. It's a bloodsucker plant! Of all the dangers that were present in those prehistoric times, the thing that frightened Bunjee most was the bloodsucker plant. 2 of his relatives had fallen victim to its sticky tentacles in the past, and his mother had always warned him not to go near strange plants. "Andy!" he screamed. "Andy, Andy, 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 Andy!" Andy woke up and gave Bunjee a cheerful wave. "It's a bloodsucker plant!" shouted Bunjee. "Karen's in a bloodsucker plant!" Andy waved up at him again and went back to sleep. Bunjee groaned loudly. What on earth could he do? He was very frightened of the bloodsucker plant, but he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Maybe he was too late already and Karen was already dead. He looked around frantically for something to throw. Suddenly he remembered how the children had saved themselves from the pterodactyl, and an idea occurred to him. An absurd idea, a crazy idea, but one which might just work. He leapt off the wall and into the nest. He sat down and gave his feet a thorough licking, and then carefully, so as not to break them, he stuck an egg onto each foot. Quickly he inflated his trunk, squirmed over the edge of the nest and floated out into the space, releasing air from his balloon-like trunk at the same time and descending rapidly. By moving the tip of his trunk around, he was able to steer himself in the direction that he wanted, and seconds later was zooming in diagonally towards the great trumpet-shaped plant. He was terribly frightened. At any second, he expected the dreadful white tentacles to reach out of the green trumpet and envelop him, but he gritted his teeth and rushed onwards. When he was near, he took an enormous breath and re-inflated his trunk. This almost brought him to a halt, and he dangled about 7 meters above the gaping mouth. With pounding heart, he looked down. He could see the wet red hairs on the throat of the plant, darkening deeper and deeper down until they disappeared into blackness. No sign of Karen, and his face creased with agony at the thought that he might be too late. I'll show you a picture. There he is. And he's got a spotty egg stuck to the base, the sole of each foot with his suckers. He stuck his legs out at right angles to his body and then brought them together with all his strength. The eggs crashed and smashed together with the putrid green yolk pouring out and right down the gullet of the plant. The smell of the 4 6-month-old pterodactyl eggs was unbelievable. Ugh. Bunjee deflated his trunk with one last snort like an untied balloon that had just been released and zigzagged off until he landed in the top of a tree. Winded, he scrambled through the foliage and peeked out anxiously at the bloodsucker plant. For a long time, nothing happened. The great trumpet stood green, unmoving, formidable. Then, from somewhere way down, there came a deep gurgle. A kind of coughing sound, like a very old man clearing his throat. The plant started to jerk convulsively. Suddenly, it seemed to stoop lower. Its middle part bellied out, fatter, another loud throaty gurgle, and then it sprang back into place and spat, the loudest spitting noise you could imagine. From the mouth shot a great stream of foul-smelling egg, 2 small furry animals, and Karen. She sailed up into the air, her face screwed up in an expression of disgust. She did 2 somersaults and landed with a bump right on top of Andy. Andy jerked upright, his eyes starting from his head, and for a moment or two, neither said a word. Karen, because she was too astonished at ever seeing the outside world again, and Andy, because all the breath had been knocked out of him. But at last, after much gasping and puffing, he managed to yell indignantly, "What on earth are you doing, you great fathead?" Karen was still in a state of shock and promptly burst into tears. "Oh, you smell awful." Andy pulled himself out from under her wet body and held his nose in disgust. Karen wailed even louder. She got to her feet and staggered away from the small wood. Andy followed, still holding his nose. When she was sure that she was well out of reach of the plant, she fell to her knees, put her head in her hands, and she howled. Such a relief to still be alive. She was wet though, horribly sticky, and Andy was right. She did smell awful. It was also a relief, after all the tensions of the past few hours, to have a really good weep and get it out of her system. Andy stood a few feet away, utterly perplexed. He just couldn't understand it. He wanted to comfort his sister, but the smell wouldn't let him get close enough. He was aware that he now smelt pretty badly too. His shirt was saturated where Karen had landed on him, all very confusing for him. He wished he could stop her crying and she could explain what had happened. But just then he felt a soft tap on his shoulder. Bunjee stood behind him, wearing a worried expression. "Is she going to be all right?" he asked. "Oh, Bunjee, thank goodness you're here," Andy said. "Have you any idea what's going on?" Bunjee looked extremely distressed. He was shaking all over. It was the closest he'd ever come to a bloodsucker plant, and perhaps the only brave thing he'd ever done in his life. "Thank heaven she's all right," he said. "But what's happened?" said Andy in exasperation. Well, there was no answer, because Bunjee had fainted. Well, we're ready for chapter 9 now. Look at these pages. There's a few more chapters to go, and that means we've got to have a few more adventures. So tune in to chapter 9. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.